I want to tell you a story.
Washington, D.C., September 1946. A 34-year-old schoolteacher. Every dollar she earned, she counted twice. She saved $3,000 over 8 years. She put it in a savings account, 2% interest, safe, responsible, smart. By 1955, she still had $3,000. But groceries were 33% more expensive. Rent was 40% higher. Her $3,000 was still $3,000, but it could only buy what $1,900 used to. Dorothy didn't lose her money in a crash. Nobody robbed her. The government just quietly made her money worth less, and she never even noticed.
Wait, actually, I'm going to let Dorothy tell the story.
Hey guys, Dorothy here. Hit like and subscribe so we can get motivated. So, let's go. Let's start with the debt itself, $39 trillion. I know you've heard that number. It's thrown around so much, it stops meaning anything. So let me give you some real context. If you stacked $39 trillion in $100 bills, the pile would reach the moon and back 4 times. If you started paying it off at $1 million per day, it would take 100 to 7,000 years, but the debt by itself isn't actually the biggest problem. The real problem is the interest for years. The U.S. borrowed money almost for free. Interest rates were near zero. It was like borrowing for free. A credit card with 0% APR. Forever. But then inflation hit. Interest rates went up. Now the U.S. is paying 4 to 5% interest on $40 trillion. That's more than the entire U.S. defense budget. Just in interest. Not to build anything new. Not to pay anyone's benefits. Just interest. The Congressional Budget Office projects interest payments reach $2.1 trillion by 2036. By 2036, interest alone eats more than a third of all federal tax revenue. This is what economists call a debt spiral. The more you borrow, the more interest. More interest, bigger deficit. Bigger deficit, more borrowing. Repeat, forever. There is no comfortable exit from this, which means the government has exactly 3 options, 2 of which are politically impossible. The third is financially devastating. Option 1. Austerity. You raise taxes, cut spending, run a surplus. Slowly, over decades, you chip away at the debt. Does it work? Yes. Will it happen? Absolutely not. The U.S. needs to cut or raise taxes by $800 billion per year just to stabilize. Not pay off, just stabilize. That means cutting Medicare, Social Security, defense, raising every tax you can think of. Every single one of those things ends political careers. Austerity is the correct answer. But in the real world, it's not going to happen. Option 2. Default. The government says, we borrowed too much. We can't pay it all back. 14 countries have defaulted since 2000. Argentina, Greece, Sri Lanka, Lebanon. For the U.S., this is never going to happen. We have the world's reserve currency. If the U.S. defaults, it doesn't just hurt America. It collapses the entire global financial system. So default is theoretically possible. Practically, never happening. Which leaves us with the magic third option. Shrink the debt with inflation. Keep interest rates below inflation. Let prices rise. Repay yesterday's debt with tomorrow's cheaper dollars. The debt on paper stays the same, but inflation slowly erodes it away. Imagine you took out a $10,000 mortgage in 1960. Today, that $10,000 is barely 3 months' rent. The debt is still there. But it became easier to pay off over time. That's exactly how the government could shrink the national debt, without ever actually paying it down. And it all happens behind the scenes, without anyone talking about it, without people realizing they are the ones absorbing the cost. Now here's what makes this more than just theory. They've done it before. Exactly. Step by step. And it worked. After World War II, U.S. debt hit 106% of GDP. Higher than where we are today. The entire country was asking, how does America ever pay this back? Every economist, every senator, every newspaper was asking the same question. The country had won the war, but nearly bankrupted itself doing it. The answer they found was simple, quiet, and absolutely devastating. For anyone who had saved money, the Federal Reserve, under intense pressure from the Treasury Department, pegged interest rates at artificially low levels. Long-term government bonds, paying 2.5% interest, fixed, regardless of what the economy was actually doing. These rates were locked in from 1942 all the way to 1951. 9 years of artificially cheap money. The government just said, interest rates are low now, end of story. Not because the economy needed it, not because inflation was under control, but because they desperately needed cheap money to stay afloat, of course. This inevitably led to runaway inflation, at points hitting 10% annualized price increases. Prices rising faster than wages, faster than savings, faster than anyone expected. But here's the thing. It got the job done. An IMF study later calculated that without this strategy, the debt-to-GDP ratio would have only fallen to 74% by 1974. Instead, it fell to 23%. Financial repression didn't just help. It did almost all the work. The people who paid for it were savers, everyday people. Bondholders who were technically earning 2.5% on paper, while losing real value every single year once you accounted for actual inflation. Negative returns. Silent. Invisible. Nobody told Dorothy what was happening. There was no announcement, no headline, no press conference where some official stood up and said, "Sorry folks, we're quietly taking value from your savings to pay our war debt. It just happened." In the background, while people went to work and raised their families, now look at where we are today. $39 trillion. Runaway interest payments. Political gridlock, making austerity impossible. The conditions are almost identical to 1946, which is exactly why what's coming next should have your full attention. So here's where things get very interesting. And very current. Because this isn't just history anymore. The exact same machinery is being switched back on. Right now, in 2025 and 2026. And most people have absolutely no idea it's happening. In May 2025, Kevin Warsh was appointed as the new chair of the Federal Reserve, and his entire approach to the debt problem is, to put it simply, unconventional, counterintuitive, and extremely deliberate. His thesis is basically this: the best way to get interest rates down permanently is to first shrink the Federal Reserve's own balance sheet, which, on the surface, sounds completely backwards. If the Fed sells bonds, supply rises, prices fall, rates go up. Basic economics says the opposite should happen. Here's the argument. After years of printing money and injecting it into the system, the Federal Reserve is still sitting on $6.6 trillion in assets. Banks are sitting on mountains of excess reserves. And to keep those reserves parked safely, not flooding into the economy, causing more inflation, the Fed has to pay banks interest. Every single day. Think about how absurd that is. The Federal Reserve is literally paying commercial banks, with money the Fed itself printed, to just sit still and not make inflation worse. The government is bribing banks with government-created money to not destroy the government's own currency. That's the system right now. Warsh's argument is clean. Shrink the balance sheet. Stop bribing banks to hold money the Fed printed to begin with. Once the system is cleaner, the Fed regains genuine control to lower interest rates without inflation spiraling. A smaller balance sheet signals fiscal discipline. It tells investors, we're serious. We're not just endlessly printing. And when investors believe that, the risk premium they demand on U.S. debt shrinks. Rates can come down naturally. Then, there's the AI wildcard. Warsh believes that AI-driven productivity could expand the economy significantly without triggering inflation. If businesses can produce more output with less input, GDP grows, tax revenue rises, and the national debt becomes smaller as a percentage of a larger economy. Without anyone having to actually pay it down, if the AI wildcard works, the economy grows, the debt burden shrinks as a percentage of GDP, And Warsh looks like an absolute genius. If it doesn't work, the debt keeps spiraling, the pressure to inflate keeps building, and eventually there's only one exit left. The same exit Dorothy walked through without knowing it. And here is where the government gets a little bit sneaky, because the inflation option doesn't just require printing money and hoping people don't notice. It requires something else. It requires controlling the story, and the story is told through the data. Because here's the thing most people never consider: lower reported inflation numbers directly benefit the government financially. Every 0.25% reduction in reported CPI saves the government hundreds of billions of dollars in inflation-adjusted payments. Social Security adjustments, bond interest calculations, government salary scales, all tied to CPI. When CPI goes down on paper, the government pays less, automatically, quietly. Now take that understanding and apply it to the next time you see an official inflation report come out, and the number seems lower than what you're actually experiencing at the grocery store, at the gas station, at the doctor's office. That gap between the official number and your lived experience is not a coincidence. It's a feature, not a bug. Let's go deeper into exactly how the inflation number gets manipulated. Because this isn't conspiracy theory. This is documented government methodology, with documented names and documented history. And once you understand it, you will never look at an inflation report the same way again. In the 1990s, the way inflation is calculated was significantly revised. The core change introduced something called substitution bias. The old method assumed simple logic. If steak gets more expensive, people spend more money on steak. The price of steak goes up. Inflation goes up. Simple, honest. The new method, the method we still use today, says something different. When steak gets too expensive, people switch to chicken to save money. So the government measures the cost of what people can actually afford to buy, not the cost of what they used to be able to afford. The result: lower reported inflation. Even if your grocery bill went up significantly, even if your purchasing power collapsed, the problem isn't that people don't switch to cheaper options. They absolutely do. The problem is that you're now measuring the cost of what people can afford after being pushed down, not the cost of the life they used to live. So inflation officially goes down, while your standard of living goes down with it. And both things count as success in the report. Then there's the hedonic adjustment. This one is particularly creative. If a car gets more expensive, the government doesn't automatically count that as inflation. Instead, they calculate how much better the car is compared to previous models. More airbags, backup camera, better fuel efficiency, touchscreen. And they say, the price didn't really go up. You're simply getting more car for your money. The extra cost is justified by extra features. Now I want to be completely fair here. There is logic in this. Cars genuinely do have more features. You genuinely do get more for your money in certain ways. But here's the catch that nobody talks about. You don't get to choose whether you want those features or not. You can't buy a 2026 car without the backup camera. You can't opt out of the safety systems. The features are mandatory, and they're used to mathematically justify a price increase that absolutely still impacts your wallet. And here is the most important thing to understand about all of this. The Bureau of Labor Statistics, the agency that calculates CPI, is funded by the government. It reports to the government, and the government saves hundreds of billions of dollars every time the CPI reading comes in lower. The financial incentive to measure low is not subtle. It is built directly into the institutional structure. The same dynamic plays out in jobs numbers. Monthly reports come out, strong job creation, market reacts, headlines run. Then 2 months later, quiet revision. Real numbers significantly weaker than initially reported. But the revision gets no headline. The market has already moved. The narrative is already set. Only the first number matters to most people. And here's one nobody talks about. The jobs report counts the same person twice if they get a second job. If 200,000 people take on a part-time job on top of their existing job, The headline says 200,000 new jobs created. What it doesn't say, those were 200,000 people who needed a second income just to make ends meet. The economy was strong enough to create jobs, but not strong enough for one job to be enough. Now, does this mean every number is fake? No. Does it mean the government is sitting in a room somewhere maniacally manipulating every data point? No. What it means is that when the institution measuring the problem has a significant financial incentive to measure it low, and when the methodology has multiple adjustment mechanisms that trend in that direction, and when revisions consistently go one way, you should factor that into how much you trust the headline number. The real test is simple. Look at what you're actually spending. Then, look at the official number. If your grocery bill went up 30%, but the headline says inflation is 2.4%, the gap between those two things is the gap between what the government needs you to believe and what's actually happening to your purchasing power. And here's the final layer of this. It's not just CPI. It's not just jobs. The same pressure, the same institutional incentives, the same directional bias exists across virtually every major economic indicator that the government uses to tell its own story about how well it's managing the economy. The data ecosystem is not neutral. It never was. And in an era where $39 trillion needs to quietly disappear, it's less neutral than ever. We are now at the 100th visual of this video, and we've laid the full foundation, the problem, the history, the current plan, and how the story gets managed. Now comes the part that actually matters for you personally: who wins, who loses, and what you can do about it right now. So let's be completely clear about what financial repression actually is at its core. Strip away all the technical language, the CPI adjustments, the balance sheet mechanics, the Fed policy frameworks. What you're left with is something much simpler and much more uncomfortable. It's a wealth transfer. A massive, systematic, legally sanctioned transfer of wealth from people who saved money to the entity that borrowed too much of it. It moves value from savers to borrowers, from individuals holding cash to institutions holding assets, from the careful and responsible to the leveraged and powerful. And it does this not through taxation, which requires a vote, not through legislation, which requires debate, but through the quiet, invisible erosion of purchasing power that nobody ever signs off on and nobody ever announces. Here is exactly who loses. First, cash savers. If inflation runs at 4% and your savings account pays 1%, you are losing 3% of your real wealth every single year. That sounds small, but run that math over 10 years and a $50,000 emergency fund becomes worth the equivalent of roughly $35,000 in today's purchasing power. You didn't spend it. You didn't gamble it. You just held it. And the system quietly took 30% of its value while you were busy living your life second. Fixed income earners, retirees, people on pensions, anyone whose income was set years ago and doesn't automatically adjust upward with prices. These people made a deal with the system. Work hard, save responsibly, live modestly in retirement on a fixed amount. The system accepted that deal, and then changed the terms quietly, decades later, without telling them third. And this one is particularly brutal. Anyone waiting on the sidelines, the person who saved carefully for a house down payment and decided to wait for prices to drop, the person who kept their investment money in cash because the market felt too uncertain, the careful person, the patient person, the responsible person who was taught that patience is a virtue and cash is safety. For them, financial repression is a punishment for doing exactly what they were told to do. Now here is who wins. And this is important, because understanding who wins is not about being angry at those people. It's about understanding the mechanics so you can position yourself correctly. Asset holders, people who own real estate, stocks, businesses, commodities, anything with tangible underlying value. When money loses purchasing power, real assets don't lose value along with it. They reprice upward in dollar terms, not because they got better, but because the dollar measuring them got weaker. Real estate in particular becomes a near-perfect hedge against financial repression. And here's the beautiful irony. If you have a fixed-rate mortgage, you're actually on the winning side of this equation. The bank lent you $300,000 in 2022 dollars. You are slowly paying it back with $2,026, $2,030, $2,034, each worth less than the one before. The bank gets repaid, but it gets repaid in currency that buys progressively less. You win. The bank, technically, takes the real loss. Debtors win. Asset owners win. The government wins. Its $39 trillion becomes progressively easier to service as real dollar value declines. The people who lose, consistently, quietly, without exception, are the ones who saved in cash and trusted the system to protect that cash's value. That's not an accident. That's the architecture. And here's the uncomfortable truth that ties all of this together. This is not a partisan issue. This is not a Democrat problem or a Republican problem. Every administration since Nixon has benefited from this system. Every Federal Reserve chair has operated within it. Every Congress has been relieved by it, because it solves the hardest political problem in existence. How do you make a $39 trillion debt more manageable without asking anyone to vote for the solution? The answer: you don't ask. You just do it, slowly, quietly, while the news cycle focuses somewhere else. The system isn't broken. This is the system working exactly as designed, for exactly the people it was designed to work for. Understanding that is not pessimism. It's not conspiracy. It's the first step toward making sure you're not on the wrong side of it. So now what? Let me be direct with you, because vague advice at this point would be an insult to everything we just covered together. I'm not your financial advisor. Nothing in this video is financial advice, but I can tell you what the math says. I can tell you what history shows. And I can tell you what doing nothing has cost every Dorothy who came before you. First, understand that doing nothing is itself a decision, a very expensive one. Keeping your money in a savings account earning 1 to 2%, while inflation runs at 3 to 4%, is not safety. It feels like safety. It looks like safety. Your account balance goes up slightly every month, but in real terms, in terms of what that money can actually buy you, you are going backward every single day. The account statement lies to you, not maliciously. Just mathematically, Dorothy's mistake wasn't that she saved. Saving is good. Dorothy's mistake was that she saved in the wrong form, in a currency that the government could quietly devalue, rather than in things that hold their value, independent of what the dollar does. The lesson from 1946 is not don't save. The lesson is, what you save in matters as much as how much you save. Second, think in assets, not dollars. This is the single biggest mindset shift that separates people who survive inflationary periods from people who get quietly wiped out by them. Dollars are the measuring stick, but the measuring stick itself is shrinking. So measure your wealth not in how many dollars you have, but in how many real things those dollars can claim. Real estate, equities, businesses, commodities, things that exist in the physical or productive world independent of what any government decides to do with its currency. Historically, and this is not speculation, this is documented across multiple inflationary periods, across multiple countries, across multiple decades. The assets that survive financial repression best are the ones that are priced in dollars, but don't move with the dollar. Real estate historically outpaces inflation over long periods. Equities, ownership stakes in real businesses, tend to reprice upward as costs and revenues rise with inflation. Commodities like gold and silver have served as inflation stores across literally thousands of years of human civilization. Third, pay attention to real data, not just official data. This doesn't mean you distrust everything. It means you run a parallel check. Look at what you're actually spending at the grocery store each month. Look at what rent costs in your city. Look at what healthcare actually costs out of pocket. Then compare that to the official inflation number. The gap between your lived experience and the headline figure. That gap is information. It's telling you something the official number is not. Because here's the thing about the people who came out of the post-World War II financial repression era having protected their wealth. They weren't geniuses. They weren't insiders. They weren't rich to begin with. What they had was the right framework. They understood that the government had a problem, that the government had a solution, and that the solution required ordinary people to pay quietly for it, and they chose, simply, to not be the ones paying. The worst thing you can do right now is sit on a pile of cash and assume it will have the same purchasing power in 10 years. Because if the pattern holds, and the pattern has held every single time this playbook has been run, it won't. Not dramatically. Not in a crash you can point to. Just quietly. Year by year. Dollar by dollar. The way it always happens. And the good news, and there genuinely is good news in all of this, is that once you understand the mechanism, you stop being the person it happens to, and you start being the person who anticipated it. You don't need to be wealthy to shift your thinking. You don't need to be an economist to understand the direction this is moving. You just need to understand what's actually happening, which after watching this video, you now do. Let's go back to Dorothy one more time. She never found out what happened. She just noticed, slowly, quietly, that her savings didn't seem to go as far as she expected, that the retirement she planned felt somehow smaller than she'd imagined. She assumed she just hadn't saved enough. She had. The game just changed while nobody was watching. She did everything right. She worked. She saved. She trusted. She was patient. She was responsible. And the system, quietly, legally, without a single headline, took a significant portion of what her patience had earned. Not from her account. From the purchasing power of every dollar inside it, the people who came out ahead. In the 1940s, in the 1970s, in every inflationary period, history has recorded, weren't smarter than Dorothy. They weren't more hard-working. They just understood one thing she didn't. That the value of money is not decided by how carefully you save it. It's decided by people in buildings she never walked into, making decisions she was never told about, solving problems she didn't know existed. Now you know. You know the building. You know what happens inside it. You know why. You know who pays for it. And you know, unlike Dorothy, that you have a choice about which side of this equation you end up on. Don't be Dorothy. If this video changed how you see things, share it with someone who needs to understand what's coming. Not to scare them. To give them the same thing you just got. Information. Because in a system designed to work quietly, awareness is the only thing that gives you a choice. See you in the next one.